Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Dr. Trevor McCrisken on the issue of drones and warfare in the 21st century. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and program officer at the Balsley School of International Affairs. Every week on the program, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of international affairs. Today our guest is Dr. Trevor McCrisken. He is an associate professor of U.S. politics and international studies at Warwick University. Welcome to the program.
Hello.
I wonder if we could start with a seemingly simple question, and that is, what are drones and what are they used for?
Okay, well, drones are basically unmanned aerial vehicles, and they can be used for a whole range of different types of activity. The US government, US military uses them mostly for reconnaissance, for tracking individuals. They also have a widespread number of commercial uses as well. We've even got pizzas being delivered by drone in some parts of the world. So it's just an unmanned vehicle that's remote controlled, either from close quarters with some of these more commercial elements, or from many thousands of miles away in the case of the US military's drones. What we've become most familiar with, I think, is weaponized drones. Right. These are the drones that are being used now by the Obama administration to pursue its war on terror against Al-Qaeda and its associated groups, and has also been used pretty extensively in the wars that the US has been fighting since the war against terrorism began in 2001. And so the current campaign against Islamic State, for example, in Iraq and into Syria, some of that is being done with more conventional sort of aerial bombardment, but drones are being used also in that area.
When did these become a viable military option?
Okay, well, some form of drone has been around for quite a long time. I mean, the Israelis were using them for reconnaissance in the 1980s. Right. But in terms of weaponized drones, this is really a 21st century phenomenon. The US first used them in 2004. The Bush administration used them not very extensively, but there were just under 50 strikes in total used by the Bush administration from 2004 to when they left office in the beginning of 2009. The Obama administration immediately ramped up the use of drones significantly when coming to power, partly because the technology was improving, and so they were becoming a much more viable option to use, but also I think because they were recognized as being a highly effective way of going after suspected terrorist targets, and far cleaner and in some ways easier than some of the other options that were available to the US government.
Well, just kind of building on that point, what is so seductive about drones? And as you've noted in some of your writing, the Obama administration has employed them in over 300 different occasions. Why is this such a tempting weapon to use?
Well, the arguments made by the Obama administration and by those that support the drone campaign is that they are the cleanest, most precise, most focused form of military hardware that the US has. And so where perhaps in the past, if a terrorist suspect was identified in a location, you may need to send in ground forces, you may need to send in, maybe a crack special forces team, something like that. You put your soldiers at considerable risk going into enemy territory. You also made it much more likely that there would be some kind of collateral damage, casualties for civilians, etc. Very difficult firefights, perhaps in built-up areas of hostile cities or whatever, or in the case with a lot of these drone attacks, actually they're in very remote areas which would have been difficult to access. So one of the things that makes this such a tempting type of technology is that it appears to be, at least on the US side, very cost-free. Right. You almost completely minimize the chances of casualties to your side, and the argument goes that actually you minimize casualties on the other side as well. You can pinpoint very precisely, sometimes just an individual that you want to destroy, rather than taking out large swathes of a city or big areas through more conventional aerial bombing. And so therefore it's considered by some to be even the term a humanitarian form of warfare, whereby you minimize the chances of casualties on both sides, particularly to the perpetrator, because you've got people controlling these remotely, often from the United States itself, even though they're operating in places like Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, etc. So the risks to the United States armed forces are exceptionally low, while supposedly the accuracy of the missiles that are fired from the drones means that you're minimizing collateral damage. You're making this a very pinpoint action, and it's kind of taken to the nth degree the kind of virtual warfare, I guess, that we've been thinking about for quite some time.
Right.
But, particularly since the Persian Gulf War in 1991, where the emphasis was on distance killing, if you like. So using the US military advantage, the technological advantage, to met out violence against your supposed enemies, but doing it in such a way that you're trying to minimize the casualties to your side. And that's something that is extremely seductive, extremely popular, actually, among the US public. They like the idea of being able to keep themselves safe from terrorism while not suffering great casualties. It's not the kind of Afghanistan campaign or Iraq campaigns that we saw in the first part of the war on terror. This is really moving things into an entirely new area.
For our next section, I want to pick up on some of these ideas and continue our discussion of how the Obama administration is using drones. We will be back in a moment with Dr. Trevor McCrisken. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Trevor, I wonder if we could pick up our discussion of the Obama administration's drone policy. Mm-hmm. And as you've noted in some of your writing, both the Pentagon and the CIA are using drones.
Right.
Is this a situation where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing?
I mean, I don't know how much cooperation there is between the two. I imagine there is some, certainly. But what's been interesting about the way the Obama administration has revealed details of its drone campaign, its weaponized drone campaign, is that both, as you say, the Pentagon and the CIA are in charge of different parts of this campaign. And so in Pakistan, where the largest number of drone attacks have taken place, it's the CIA that's in charge. Right. And it's the CIA that is, on the whole, making the decisions as to who will be targeted, when strikes will take place, and then operating those drones that are undertaking those attacks. Outside of Pakistan, in the other areas where drones have been used, now they've been used pretty extensively in, as I said, Afghanistan and Iraq, also in the Libya conflict in 2011, so in more traditional sort of wars that the US has been taking part in. But the targeted killing campaign, which is the campaign against the suspected terrorists, the Pentagon is in charge of those operations outside of Pakistan. And so in Yemen, in Somalia, where strikes have also taken place, those have been under the control of the Pentagon. Now, we've had fairly considerable amount of detail revealed by the Obama administration about how the decision-making processes take place when the Pentagon is in charge of drone strikes. And it does appear that there is a kind of chain of command that works its way up from the Pentagon to the White House. Right. And that on most strikes that the Pentagon has perpetrated, that Obama has personally signed off on those. So far as we can tell, there's far less command and control in terms of what the CIA is doing in Pakistan. Now that you can make all kinds of reasons as to why that might be. You know, it's maybe because of the nature of the relationship with Pakistan, the role of the Pakistani secret intelligence as well in helping with targeting. But the CIA seems to have more autonomy. And this troubles a lot of people, because if this technology is being used supposedly to go after dangerous terrorists who are an imminent threat to the United States, but we don't know the detail of that even after the strikes, it does raise serious issues about accountability, particularly in what is purportedly the greatest democracy on earth. It does seem that the president is talked to if the CIA believes that they don't have a particularly clear shot, if you like, that they fear that there may be considerable collateral damage. They may have to attack a wider area than some of the more pinpointed strikes. And in those circumstances, we're led to believe from the various reporting there's been on this that the president does get consulted and does have final say. But on the whole, it appears that the CIA can operate within Pakistan with its drones in whatever way it sees fit.
Really?
That it almost has a carte blanche to operate in Pakistan. And this does trouble people, Human Rights Watch and other organisations that are quite critical of the drones campaign. It's been interesting really that I think in the first maybe 3-4 years that Obama was using drones, very little was said at all about them. It was kind of a deniable campaign. There was lots of reporting, both domestically in the US and internationally, about the use of drones, but no official acknowledgement. I think Obama's come to realise over the course of his presidency that really wasn't good enough, that there was a lot of concern, and that he felt the need to give out more detail. And I think he has done that, but it's mostly been focused on what the Pentagon is doing, whilst neatly ignoring really any need to reveal what the CIA is doing with its drone campaigns. Now there is oversight in the US Senate. You've got the Senate Intelligence Committee, which has met at least a few times to have members of the CIA report to them on what they're doing. But there's far less public acknowledgement of what's happening in Pakistan. Now the number of attacks has reduced in Pakistan. It was at a high in 2010 and has fallen away steadily since then. But we still have some 20 odd attacks each year taking place within Pakistan. And I think that really does raise questions about how legitimate, how accountable is this campaign? Who are these individuals that are being killed? We're told after the strikes occur that these are high-ranking members of Al-Qaeda or associated groups, but because there's very little independent verification, you've only got the word of anonymous CIA officials or other members of the administration who will come out and tell you these were really dangerous terrorists. But we don't necessarily have the information that we need to be able to verify that is the case. So again, I think there are some serious questions to be asked about how legitimate an approach this is, and that's before we even get into things like international law, domestic law, etc.
Well, on that point, perhaps for the third segment of the show, we can touch on some of these issues of national security and rule of law. We will be back in a moment with Dr. Trevor McCrisken. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Trevor, we've touched on this already, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the effects or the impacts that the use of drones are having on national security in the US.
Okay. Well, if you take what the Obama administration says to be true, we're led to believe that this is having a massively positive effect on its counterterrorism campaign. There have been various assessments of the drone campaign that have been issued by Obama himself and also by John Brennan, who's now the CIA director, but was working in the White House on this campaign, to say that this has really decimated the upper levels of Al-Qaeda, that its associated groups have been adversely affected by the drone strikes, that it's really minimized the threats that the United States is facing from international terrorism. They maybe don't talk quite as positively about that now that the Islamic State issue has risen up so strongly. But I think they kind of see that as detached from the use of drones against Al-Qaeda and other groups such as that. So I think definitely the conclusions that the Obama administration reaches that this is a truly successful campaign. Whether we agree with that or not, I think it goes back to the points I was making earlier about not really knowing who these individuals are that are being killed. There have been some very well-known leaders within Al-Qaeda and its various associated groups who have been killed in drone attacks. And so to some extent it's true that those higher-ranking members have been killed, but there have been many hundreds of other so-called members of Al-Qaeda that have died in these attacks, but we don't really know how important they were to the organization or not. And it does feel as though the measure of success here is really being based on what you might call death statistics.
Right.
So it's number of enemy killed equals high level of success, when there's no or very little discussion of what the qualitative nature of those killings might be,
right.
and also perhaps what the long-term consequences might be. Some critiques of the targeted killing campaign argue that this is a very bad thing because it's actually just generating more terrorists.
Sure.
That you're, by putting at risk populations in areas where, let's face it, the US is not particularly popular to begin with, that you're just generating more and more anger, more and more distrust of America, and its allies as well, and that this is just going to perpetrate the problems of terrorist groups, and that it's a recruiting device really. Sure. For Al-Qaeda and its associated groups. There's also the issue, which is, it's kind of interesting that, for many years, the people that are now critical of drones were critical of Guantanamo Bay, right. and of CIA rendition and the seizing of terrorist suspects and then their interrogation to get information out of them. Some of those same people now are saying, actually, what about the fact that we can't now right. Capture, or we tend not to capture these terrorist suspects, we kill them instead? Is that actually undermining national security because you're not getting the level of information right. that you could get from a captive terrorist right. Suspect? And so, there's a range of questions, I think, that perhaps undermine the claims that this is a highly effective counterterrorism measure, that it maybe isn't reducing the threat to the US. It may actually be increasing that threat by generating more sure. individuals who will join groups like Al-Qaeda. There's also that issue of how much information are we actually losing? Right. Okay, we may be killing a large number of operatives that may be taking part in plots against American interests, but if we were seizing those individuals, capturing them, interrogating them, maybe putting them on trial, right. It would make the job of counterterrorism potentially more effective because you would have more information about what is being right. planned.
Well, just on that last point about putting them on trial, what are some of the effects that these drones are or could have on international rule of law and, say, international criminal justice? Mm-hmm. And if these people are being targeted in an extrajudicial way, that really takes the option of trying them in a court yeah. off the table.
Yeah, and again, the most critical voices are accusing the Obama administration effectively of using assassination by drone. Right. That none of these individuals have the opportunity to prove their innocence. None of these individuals have an opportunity to give any kind of evidence as to what they were really doing, why they were right. doing it, etc. And the US Justice Department has been heavily involved in trying to help the Obama administration justify its position on this, and the legal counsels within the White House, within the Pentagon, and also, so far as we know, within the CIA as well. There is a lot of legal discussion about what can we do, who can we target, what justifications can we give. Right. But all of those legal counsel seem utterly convinced that what the United States is doing here is completely within the bounds of domestic US law and international law. Right. They see this very much as being part of a legitimate war against terrorist groups that are threatening not just the United States but other countries as well. Right. And that when you're effectively in war, even if it's not with another state, it's with a loose conglomeration of terrorist groups, whatever you define Al-Qaeda as, this is legitimate. Right. This level of force is acceptable. It's not that different to other types of force that have been used in the past. The technology is different, but the end result is the same. Right. You reduce the threat. It's cleaner, it's better. You don't get so many casualties on the civilian front, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Even though that point, of course, is disputed. Sure. And there are many groups that are trying to monitor the use of drone attacks to actually try to figure out who is being killed, and their claims are much higher numbers sure. of civilian casualties than the US government has admitted to or will calculate itself. So I think, there's a lot of a lot of debate around what the legal justification is for the use of targeted killing. But as I say, the US Obama administration is very convinced that this is fine,
right.
Even to the point of allowing the killing of US citizens who have turned to Al-Qaeda, right. Who are working with that group or associated groups. And the biggest legal document that we have is evidence that the Justice Department issued something like a 50-page document justifying the attack on Anwar al-Awlaki,
right.
Who was a US citizen operating with Al-Qaeda. So I think that legal issue is certainly there. The United Nations has a commission in Geneva which is investigating the use of drones and may well conclude that we need to have some form of new international law that covers the use of this weaponry, right. Perhaps as we have with chemical weapons, other types of weaponry. But certainly from the US point of view, they've got this covered. Right. It's within the bounds of what's acceptable. I don't think they see that it's something that they should be stepping back from.
Sure. We will be back in a moment with Dr. Trevor McCrisken. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Trevor, I wonder if we might end off by talking about where this technology is going and what the future of warfare might look like. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, there's lots of sort of references to science fiction movies, sure. And the kind of Terminator future where you're going to have robots fighting robots. We may well be heading that way. Who knows? But I think it is interesting to think about over the next, probably not that long actually, maybe 5 to 10 years, when the use of drones for any number of things. I mean, at the beginning of the podcast, we talked about the commercial uses. You know,
right.
The pizzas are going to be delivered, your Amazon packages are going to be delivered to you perhaps by drones. Drones are going to become increasingly familiar to us in our everyday lives. And that, I mean, at the moment, I think the American public and other publics in the West feel very detached and distant from what's being done with weaponized drones, mostly right. in the Middle East or Central Asia. And it feels very easy to kind of shut that off and not worry about the consequences, not think about the moral implications. I actually think that that's going to become even more difficult to understand when drones are an everyday familiar thing, when right. they are, bringing you packages, helping the police to identify criminals, acting in the wrong ways in your neighbourhoods. It's kind of taking CCTV to a step further. I think as we become more and more familiar with the domestic use of drones, their weaponized use becomes even more distant, more kind of not something to worry about right. too much. And to me, that is problematic. I think we need to really think through what the consequences of this technology is. Is it making killing too easy for the United States government? It makes it a very attractive proposition because if it is, as they argue, so clean and precise and everything else, it's just tempting to keep on using it more and more.
Sure.
Where that's going to get increasingly controversial, difficult, potentially incredibly dangerous, I think, from a security point of view for the US, is that at the moment drones are being used in countries where the US argues that the government of those countries is unable on its own to put down the threats that are being destroyed by the use of targeted killing.
Right.
And so, although in those countries, obviously, the populations are pretty anti-drone use and find this very problematic, those of us in the West don't worry about that quite so much because it's, again, long way away. We don't really care about those people, etc. Right. But what happens if drones start getting used closer to home? What if the US identifies a target maybe in a allied country, maybe even in Canada,
right.
Maybe there's somebody in the northernmost reaches of Canada, the Canadian government's thinking, we haven't got the resource, we don't see that as a particularly imminent threat, it's too distant. And then the US uses a drone to launch a missile against that target, kill those individuals within the soil of one of its allies. That then would perhaps seem more problematic,
sure.
and that might lead to greater debates about how this technology is being used. And of course, at the moment, although it's the US that's using weaponized drones, it's not going to stay that way. Other states, non-state actors will acquire this technology. And what happens then? Do we start having a different kind of war? Do we have drones against drones? Do we have, it is the sort of science fiction sort of view of the future, but
right.
It does feel as though we're heading that way. And what will that do to the resistance to war, perhaps, within societies? Will we become, if we believe that these weapons are not costing us anything, particularly in terms of lives and sacrifice that conventional wars do, again, I think that just makes it more likely that they'll be used.
Right.
There'll be less reservations about throwing support behind these. And you can see this in public opinion polls already, that some 65% of the American population completely in favour of the use of drones to target terrorists abroad. They're more worried about that happening at home.
Sure.
And again, you could see that at some point down the line that weaponized drones might be used within the United States itself. How acceptable would that be to the American public? So I think it's very hard to predict what's going to happen, but I think we are going to see more and more drone technology being used for a wide range of activity. But the lethal use of drones to launch missiles or other forms of weapons against targets is likely to be on the increase. And I think we could enter into a much more dangerous world if we have a multiple sort of drone campaign going on between different states targeting each other. And the future may look quite dangerous to us, I think. Which is why, maybe there is an argument that we need more international controls on these weapons before we reach that point where they really are out of control.
Yeah. Trevor, thank you so much. This has been fascinating and even a little terrifying. And thank you to our audience for watching. You have been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. And please do join us again for another episode of Inside the Issues.